We at the First Church of Christ Scientist in Hanover would like to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon to learn about a new approach to conflict resolution. Louder, please. Okay. We'd like to also add our thanks to the Kilton Library for letting us use this space this afternoon, and also to CATV for recording the lecture on video. A copy of the video will be uploaded to Vimeo, and there'll be a link at our church website at cshanover.com. So if you'd like a refresher on the lecture, it will be available there. A couple of notes. We do ask that you make sure that your phones are on mute or turned off, just so there won't be distractions. Restrooms, for convenience, are right around the hall to our right. And after the lecture, you're warmly encouraged to check out the literature distribution table at the back of the hall. There are some periodicals published by the Christian Science Church and some copies of the King James Version of the Bible, I think I saw, and the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, and they're available for you to take home and enjoy. So we're all here this afternoon because we share a concern about conflict in our world and want to do something to help. Our speaker, John Tyler, has dedicated his life to doing something to help. Before entering the field of Christian Science full-time, he was a social activist, working, for example, as a labor organizer to protect exploited workers. After earning degrees on both sides of the Atlantic, in Paris as well as Princeton, John worked in academics, helping students understand the issues underlying international conflict. While teaching at the University of Pittsburgh, he founded a residence for students for the purpose of healing racial division in our country. His involvement in this project earned him the Racial Justice Award from the YWCA. Ultimately, John's desire to do something to help led him to the full-time practice of Christian Science healing. As a member of the Christian Science Board of Lectureship, he travels internationally speaking, and I'd say with a tone of envy, in French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, as well as English, about the power of prayer to bring peace, health, and healing to people's lives. Some of the places John has shared this power of prayer aren't as comfortable as this lovely library. Over his career, he has visited with inmates at a state penitentiary, people trapped behind the Iron Curtain, and villages in Haiti and Africa, just to name a few. He's lectured in every continent except Antarctica, who knows what's coming up. Today, he's traveled all the way with his niece, Sarah, who we also welcome, from Portland, Maine, to be with us. So let's give a warm welcome to John Tyler.
Thank you very, very much, Jennifer. That was lovely. And I'll try to live up to some of those things that you said. It's a delight, just a real delight to be here. I grew up not too far from here, as I described to someone. Later, I heard it described as the eastern slums rural slums of Connecticut. And as you probably know, this is, Mark Twain spent the last half of his life in Hartford. And we were in the same business as one of the ones that he invested in. And that was a poultry farm. He said that he knew that there was a lot of money in the chicken business. He knew because he put it there. I must say we had a similar experience. But very seriously, it's a joy to be here. And I'd like to encourage us, I want to reason through with you a logic that I think is behind the way to resolve conflict. And of course, we're going to be talking about this from a religious standpoint, but yeah, I think it's something that's very practical. And I think it's something also that has a logic behind it. And I'd like you with me, I'm going to be suggesting what this logic is. But I would like, as I go through these points, for you to be with me. And I'm saying this because often people come to a lecture and expect to be lectured to. And in fact, Christian Science lecture committees often try to avoid that sensation that people are being lectured to and describe it in different ways. I have been describing these kinds of experiences as a think. And by that I mean to emphasize that process so that we're thinking together. In a sense, it's a kind of prayer. But it's one which has a logic to it, which makes sense if we're dealing with a religion which calls itself a science. And if at any point when I'm leading this this kind of travel through what I think is a logical field, and you feel it's not logical, raise your hand. We'll deal with it because I want us to be together mentally. Okay? Great. Conflict. It's something that seems to be increasingly present. It's something we're all aware of. We can't live in this world, I think, without becoming increasingly aware of it. However, this increase, I think, is due more to the way in which the media treats it. This isn't new, of course, but today it's surprising that even the responsible media follow the dictum, if it bleeds, it leads. And of course, when that's the case, and when we're in a kind of different world from the world we were in a generation ago. A generation ago, there was that evening news period, half hour, an hour, when we learned what was happening in the world. And it was sometimes pretty terrible. But that was just a segment of the day. Today, 24/7, we have news programs that are not only indicating the bleeding part of all the news, the sensational part, but they're taking us with them into the reporting, especially in violent areas. So we don't hear about the battle that took place yesterday. We're in the battle with them today and seeing sometimes the effects of enemy fire right around us. And the really interesting thing about this whole consciousness of conflict is that the experts in measuring conflict tell us that we're in a world of decreasing conflict. And not just recently, over the past 100 years. And this even includes the Second World War. So clearly we're in this world of decreasing conflict, but increasing consciousness of it to such an extent that we have that same kind of reaction, those in the Middle Ages, those communities that felt vulnerable, protected themselves by building walls. And the bigger, the thicker the wall, the better the protection. And I think sometimes we have that reaction today where there's fear. Fear produces that desire to prevent individuals or groups, or even nations, coming too close. And so we build our own walls. And those of you who've flown recently are aware that the walls we're building are mostly electronic. They're security systems of all kinds that are devised in London today. You can't go outside any public place. You go outside your building, your home, your hotel, and you're being watched. There's CCTV, which is literally there. If you've taken a newspaper that you're reading on your morning wait for the bus, you can be sure there's someone reading along with you. You can't drive anywhere in the country without being, on any public road at least, without being followed by these same. And again, the question I think could be raised, do we feel more secure because of these measures of security? I think not. And then we add to this, this more recent dimension, at least in our country, of political conflict. Here we live in a world, and this is not just the United States, clearly. It's just in Europe and it was fascinating to see the degree to which with the French elections, not just France. I've been in Germany before when there were French elections, and it was not a big deal. This year, it was their very existence that was in question. And this degree of polarization that exists, the Pew Charitable Trust has, a few months ago, did a survey, a very extensive survey, 10,000 adults, measuring the degree of polarization that exists in American politics today. And they found it's higher than in any time in our history since the Civil War. And of course, we're aware of that, I'm sure, this whole issue of not compromising, not even speaking with people from the other camp. And just a consciousness of division and potential conflict, if not, as we saw recently, actual conflict, put into violence that boils over. And that's the natural result of that degree of polarization. It's hatred. Well, there was an Indian Cherokee chief who was asked, with regard to all these issues, if there's anything that the man in the street, just the ordinary citizen, could do. And he answered that for him, within each of us, are two wolves fighting. There's the good wolf, the wolf of kindness, gentleness, love, peace, patience. And there's the bad wolf, the wolf of hatred, anger, revenge, jealousy. Well, the questioner asked, which wolf is going to win? And the chief answered, the one you're feeding. Well, I think you recognize it's a very simple answer, but I think one of tremendous depth. It's the question I'd like really to explore with you this afternoon. How can we feed the good wolf? And that same question, is there anything that the ordinary citizen, not an individual who's already a part of some organization, but just you or I, in our everyday lives, is there anything that these individuals can do to help deal with conflict? And this question was asked of an Interpol officer. This was in Europe. He had just written a book. Interpol is the International Criminal Police Organization. And this Interpol officer had just written a book with regard to what his specialty was, which was understanding how the mafia could take over mid-sized European governments, not just in Italy, throughout Western Europe. He was asked that question. Is there anything the man in the street can do? And it was clear the questioner expected a very definite no. Obviously, they'd be out of their depth. But in fact, the Interpol officer answered with a very positive yes. There is something that we can do. And he gave the example in his study of his awareness that those communities where there was a mafioso spirit, kind of spirit of, well, I'm going to help my own, and nobody beyond that. There's my family that I'm concerned with, my immediate friends and so forth, but that's it. And the rest of this community can deal with it as they will. Where that spirit was present, the mafia was successful in taking over at least parts, if not the whole city government. And on the contrary, in those communities where there was a sense of integrity, a sense of concern for the community, a willingness to volunteer for different organizations, concern to, just with regard to the cleanliness and so forth of the community, it was again as though the mafia could feel that. And whether or not they tried, they were not successful in taking over those communities where that mental spirit was present. Well, when I heard that, it was as though there were all kinds of bells that went off in my thought. Because to me, that's exactly what Christ Jesus is saying in his Sermon on the Mount. Probably most of you know this sermon. It's actually a group of teachings that Jesus made during his lifetime. And it's Matthew, one of his biographers in the New Testament. Matthew, well, the biblical scholars tell us, he selected the core items in in Jesus' teachings and put them together in what he described as this Sermon on the Mount. And the sermon begins with an analysis of kind of mental attitudes. They're called the Beatitudes. They're ways in which we can mentally approach all kinds of fundamental aspects of our lives. Hungering and thirsting after righteousness, peacemaking, purity of thought. And what Jesus was doing was leading into an examination of what for him was extraordinarily important. He's a Jew, and he's concerned with the way in which the law, this fundamental element in Jewish theology, in which the law was being understood. And I think it's interesting because the problem that he was dealing with, and he recognized was a major problem in his day, frankly, is very present with us today. He was concerned that the people who were studying the law and trying to understand it, and live by it, felt that it was a law governing behavior. And it sounds that way. You know, we have the thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that, and it sounds like it's what you're supposed to be doing. But he said, it's not that the behavior is unimportant, but the law has to do with your thinking. The behavior follows thought. And what is needed is to get at this change of thought and control the thought and really directing of our thinking. And he took some examples. He took the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And he explained that if you have lust in your thinking, you've already broken the commandment. He took the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And again, he said, if you're angry with anyone, you've already broken the commandment. In that way, focusing on consciousness, that crucial element that should be the most important element in our lives. What's going on in our thinking? And then he continues into what I think is the high point of the Sermon on the Mount, where he considers how to love. And interestingly, because I think there's a parallel again between what the ideas, the culture, the thought of his day 2,000 years ago, and our thought today. He said, you know, you think you're loving when you love those around you, when you love your family, your friends, those who are loving you. And he said, you know what? That has nothing to do with love. So the worst people in the world are doing that. The publicans, those individuals who are Jews, betraying their nation, cooperating with the Roman tax authorities, and not only taxing the Jews, but increasing those taxes for their own benefit, and kind of breaking a few knees if they didn't get the taxes. That's not love. And then he goes on to begin to describe what is love and what should be our goal. And finally he arrives at what I think, at least for me, is the high point of the Sermon on the Mount, where he's talking about love. And he says, I say unto you, love your enemies. And not just love your enemies, and we'll go on to something else. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. Pray for them who despitefully use you. This wasn't a minor point. This was something that, for him, was the measure of loving. And learning how to love was the central activity that we all should be about. Now, if we look at that command, love your enemies, isn't he asking us to do something impossible? If we've already defined someone as an enemy, how can we love them? We can't. It's impossible. We've already defined that individual as an enemy, or that group as an enemy. We can't do that. Now, this is a kind of conundrum. I want to put this on the back burner for just for a moment, consider a couple of other issues before getting into some examples. But I want to say that before I do that, that the founder of the church sponsoring this thing this afternoon that we're engaging in, the First Church of Christ Scientist Hanover, is a church founded by Mary Baker Eddy, very native of this state, and an individual for whom love was just crucial. And I say this because she founded a religion, and she recognized that the central aspect of that religion was love itself. She describes love as the heart and soul of the religion. It's the religion that she calls Christian Science. And the Sermon on the Mount was something that she had just tremendous respect for. She quotes, she has books, a number of books, and articles and pamphlets and so forth that she wrote. And she quotes more frequently from the Sermon on the Mount than any other part of the Bible. So clearly this was a key element in what she was working with. And that recognition of the importance of essentially thought in the consciousness of individuals as that which produces everything else clearly was for her the heart of the religion that she was founding. Now, what I'd like to do this afternoon is to look at 3 levels of conflict. Conflict within the family, kind of face-to-face, conflict at a community level, and conflict at a national, supranational level. And in each case, I'd like to essentially describe ways in which the spiritual approach was effective in dealing with conflict at all these 3 levels. The first level, and I'd like to begin at the middle for this, so this is a part of my own experience. As Jennifer mentioned, I had been teaching at the university, at Princeton University, and I took up a post at the University of Pittsburgh. Rust Belt city, large African-American population is a part of the city. And this was a time of conflict, of enormous conflict in the society, and not just in the United States. This was in 1867 that I began teaching. In French, if you're a 68er, you're one of those individuals who was a part of the revolution. They took up the cobblestones and were ready, as in 1789, to revolt, and they did revolt. And so did the Free University of Berlin was occupied, just as many universities in the United States. It was a time of the Vietnam conflict, it was a time of intense civil rights conflict. It was a time of women's liberation and conflict within that realm as well. Civil rights was the arena in which I had been working. And when I arrived, I discovered that the city council of my new city was racist, and not in a very small, discreet way. The first issue I heard about was a decision the city council was making as to whether or not to employ a black company for the city in their waste collection. And one of the city councilors gave as his reason for voting no, because they're black. That was acceptable for him. That was a reasonable, justifiable logic for refusing them a contract. I had difficulty believing that. But I saw that that wasn't that uncommon. The mayor shared the same attitude. There was one African American on the city council, the first token, and my reaction was hatred. I saw these individuals conducting the politics of the city in a way which is so destructive, so racist, that I not only hated, but I really felt totally justified in my hatred. I mean, these were bad people. And I enjoyed the hatred. It was, you know, it was that thing that one should do in those kinds of circumstances. Well, it was exactly in this context, April of 1968, that my mentor, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated. And the city of Pittsburgh erupted in the worst racial violence or violence of any kind that the city had ever known. Massive loss of life, loss of property, and a decision on the part of the governor to call out the National Guard and a National Guard occupation of the city, more severe, I think, in the history of any American city. They were there for 10 days. We had the strictest curfew that I've ever known about. You go outside of your house after 4:30 in the afternoon. It was a disaster. And I was a member of the Christian Science Church. I didn't grow up in Christian Science, but I had, in my late teens, become a Christian Scientist. And the church, that one member of the city council, the African American, actually was a member of our church. And he felt that it would be helpful if our church called a meeting of the city councilors, the political leaders of the city, of the economic leaders, industrial elite of the city, and the academic leaders, chancellors, presidents of the universities. And the church accepted that idea and called a meeting they decided to call the meeting, Love Leads the Way. To my surprise, they asked me to chair the meeting. Well, as you guessed, I accepted, but I realized put me in an extremely difficult situation. And I became aware, I think I was kind of aware, but I didn't want to admit it, that the founder of the church, Mary Baker Eddy, as I've indicated, the heart and soul of that religion was love. And there's so many statements that she makes where it's so clear that love is the only possible alternative. She says, as truth destroys error, so love destroys hate. And I had read all of those and accepted and valued those ideas as a part of the religion that I wholeheartedly wanted to support and participate in. But, you know, psychologists tell us that we're capable of holding two totally inconsistent values. And as long as we don't bring the two into conflict with each other, we don't experience what they call cognitive dissonance. Well, I was experiencing cognitive dissonance because they came into conflict with each other very clearly. If I was going to chair this meeting, love leads the way. And I was wrestling with this idea when a friend, recognizing I had a severe problem, he suggested, he said, John, imagine the individual whom you hate the most. Imagine that individual asked you to pray for him. Well, it just took a few seconds, and I realized that's the answer. I had learned in Christian Science, I had learned really a new way to pray. And it wasn't that asking God and petitioning God for an answer or a response wasn't the right thing to do. That's wonderful, it's turning towards God. But I had learned that it's important to go much beyond that and to understand the nature of God's government. to bring into consciousness an awareness of the nature of that government and how it applies to the specific problem. And so I knew in this regard, if I were to pray for this individual, and I was just going through what could I do if he asked me to pray for him, I would need really to mentally push aside a picture of that individual as a physical human being. Because I wanted in prayer, and this is what I had learned in this religion, to understand the spiritual identity, the godlike nature of an individual whom I prayed for, perhaps myself, or someone who'd ask me. And in order to do that, I needed to see beyond all the information that came to me through my physical senses. I needed to use my spiritual sense to begin to see in that spiritual way, to see the real godlike nature of the individual who asked me to pray for him. I knew that was the goal. And, you know, I was able to come, I think, to some degree to the point where I was able to do that. I was able just mentally, okay, we're not dealing with this chunk of flesh and bones. We're dealing with a divine creation, a creation of God that is God-like, is made in God's image and likeness. But there was a different element, not just the physical. The other element was my understanding of this person's history, of the background, of the thoughts, policy, preferences of this individual. And there was it was a much more difficult problem. Because that which kept knocking at my mental door was, you know, but he said these sort of things, he supported these kinds of policies, he had these attitudes. How in the world can I separate that from me? That was an enormous problem. And it was at that point that I discovered that Mary Baker Eddy had, just 80 years before, had written a little essay called Love Your Enemies. This is published in not her major work, Science and Health, the Key to the Scriptures, but another book called Miscellaneous Writings. It's a very brief little essay, about 5 pages. And it begins with 3 questions. Who is thine enemy that thou shouldest love him? Is it a creature or a thing outside thine own creation? I was creating my enemies. The third sentence, another question. Can you see an enemy except you first formulate this enemy and then look upon the object of your own conception? Pretty clear, that's what she meant. I was creating my own enemies. Well, this came as a substantial shock. But I realized she was right. I had filled my thought with these concepts of this individual as though that were the definition of his being. Whereas there was an accurate definition, which I could have started with, and that is him as God's creation. Him as really the ongoing creation of God, the purely spiritual individual, yes, not a physical being, but also an individual independent of human history. I could, in other words, again, use my spiritual sense to be able to be aware of this nature, fundamental nature of this individual. And in this process, I later realized that I was kind of deconstructing this individual as an enemy. And that's how, going back to what we just put on the back burner a short while ago, that idea of loving your enemies, you destroy the idea that you could have an enemy. You destroy all that mental activity which you've been involved in, where you've created your enemy. You move away from that. And now you redefine those individuals more accurately, starting with their creator, God, the only source, and seeing the nature of their identity as godlike. And in that way, I was able to follow that command of Jesus, to love those individuals who before appeared to be enemies, but now I could begin to see as created by God. Well, I had arrived at least not a complete understanding of all these phenomena, but a fairly clear sense, and I felt comfortable with it. I had arrived at a point where I really could identify this individual as godlike, and therefore as lovable. And that was the goal, of course, to be able to love that individual. The meeting, we didn't solve all the problems of the city, but we began. And one of the ways, very concrete ways that we began was the dean of the business school of the University of Pittsburgh became aware of the fact, I don't know if it was just at that meeting or had just before that, of the fact that they'd never had any relationship to the African American community, the entrepreneurs, economic entrepreneurs in the African American community, and decided that that would have been a tremendous bridge to exist, and that they could not only help but study and form a kind of union, partnership, which they did. Within a few months of that, and it's continued down to today. It's one of the institutes of the Katz School of Business at the University of Pittsburgh. And there was another result of that meeting. It was an inspiration that came to me to found, as Jennifer mentioned, a living event. It was a time when the whole idea of the solution of racism in the United States through integration had been proved inoperable, put it that way, because the African Americans in the country, not just in Pittsburgh and at the university, realized that was the case and decided it was crucial for them to have their own institutions. And at the University of Pittsburgh, they wanted their own library, their own course. In fact, all over the country was the beginning of courses on Africana studies, African American departments in the university were created. But I realized that in order to kind of bring a balance into this whole picture, there needed to be a context within which an equal representation of black and white students could be made. And that's what I proposed, and the university to a large degree accepted. And we created what's called an intercultural house. Intercultural in the sense of recognizing the validity of both cultures as white and black, as co-equal, and with an equal number of black and white. We're able to explore, these are full-time students, but ones that were interested in exploring the whole nature of racism and how it could be faced and diminished within the university context, within the urban context. And it was a very idealistic program. The chancellor was very much in favor of it. There were 6 vice chancellors, all of whom indicated that it was wonderful and we should support it. It's publicly. Privately, 5 of the vice chancellors came to me and said, "No, John, this is not going to work. It's impossible in our day. Within 6 months, it will surely be firebombed, and if it hasn't been by 6 months, there will be such pressure put on the African American students to withdraw that it'll collapse." That was 46 years ago. It's still intact. And as Jennifer mentioned, it received the Racial Justice Award at the YWCA, the one African American organization in the United States which has had the diminution of racism as its goal throughout its whole history. And the story doesn't end there, because in the process of founding the Intercultural House and just the first years of its development, we ran into all kinds of problems with the city. We needed zoning variances for the building. We wanted at least to have a tax exemption. And who should be the individual who spearheaded our efforts with regard to the zoning and the tax exemption? That city councilor. He became our strongest defender and a real helper and a close friend. Well, I've given this example of conflict resolution at a community level, and I haven't mentioned one element that is absolutely essential in conflict resolution, and that Jesus insisted on as unavoidable, as something that was just had to be a part of everyone's experience. And it's something that's very difficult. In fact, it's so difficult that his noisiest student, St. Peter, when he realized that Jesus was insisting on this, and also realizing how difficult it was, asked Jesus, well, how about if I just try 7 times? That's already a lot. Do you remember the quality that Peter was concerned about? Forgiveness. You guys are way ahead of me. Yes, it's forgiveness. And isn't it interesting that this is that quality which was so crucial, that Jesus was insisting upon it? And you remember Jesus' response, "No, I say unto thee, not 7 times, but until 70 times 7. And that didn't mean that once you read it at least the 491st time, you were off the hook. It meant, no, forgiveness is essential, period. You must find it. But it is difficult. And it is what's, I think, extraordinarily interesting today, and this has been the Catholic case for maybe the past 15, 20 years. During the time which there have been, as are continuing to develop, peace institutes, university courses dealing with conflict resolution, forgiveness is one of the key items that is taught in these courses. And especially as regarding societies such as Sierra Leone, Rwanda, and so forth, where it's extremely difficult. But it's still seen as essential. And within these different cultures, there's always an appreciation of the importance of forgiveness. Now, this is, I think, a wonderful development. The highlighting of forgiveness, the teaching of it, and the recognition of its significance. But I'm going to suggest that, wonderful as it is, we can go further. And frankly, what Jesus is teaching as spiritual forgiveness goes further. Now, to illustrate this, I have just a brief definition of what I would call human forgiveness. And again, I'm not in any way putting this down. This is so much better than anger, revenge, all those negative things. That it's something that's good. But this, it's limited. Here's the way many of these teachers of conflict resolution define it: is to stop feeling anger, to grant pardon for remission of an offense, conscious decision to release feelings of resentment, vengeance, toward a person or group, regardless of deserving forgiveness. Well, this is, as I say, this is great. If we can reach this is already good. But we can get to the point, I think, of, frankly, perfection. Through recognizing that when you want to forgive someone, you don't look for those good aspects. Because that's the temptation. There's some individual or a group, and you know that forgiveness is very important, and you want to see the good. So you identify something that you know that's good about it. I'm going to suggest that gets you into the problem. It creates greater difficulties. Because now you've made real that whole human situation. Whereas what you need is something that you can perceive spiritually, not kind of historical or human analysis of the situation, but that which comes through your spiritual sense. And I'm going to ask Sarah to forgive me because she's already heard this last night. But there's a.
Good to hear it more than once.
Okay. You're talking a lot about spiritual sense, and there's a, I think, temptation is to either say, yes, I know what it is, and kind of approach this superficially, or to recognize, no, this is a really difficult concept. What in the world is spiritual sense? And so what I'd like to ask you to do is to imagine a situation in which you have the opportunity to speak with two individuals who are, they're not twins, but they're very similar to each other. There's nothing that you can see physically to distinguish one from another, the same age, gender, race, and so forth. Now, you have an opportunity to speak with them just 5 minutes. And you come away from that conversation with the realization that there's one of them with whom you have a sense you're on the same wavelength. You feel values kind of coinciding, and there's just something that tells you can trust this individual. The other one, not the kind of person you want to leave holding your wallet when you lose. Now, you have not, I'm sure, had exactly that experience, but I know you've had quite a few similar ones. In fact, we have them every day. They're very common. And here, the question is, what is it that enables you to make that distinction? The reason I've set it up in such a way that there isn't anything physical is because we want to get a case in which you're not being influenced by the physical characteristics. But there is something definite that you feel. And this is what is so crucial, that is to recognize that we have this spiritual sense, that we're using it actually very frequently, sometimes consciously in prayer, but we're using it in a sense all the time. It's our moral sense. Mary Baker Eddy, at the very beginning, when she made her breakthrough, her spiritual breakthrough to understand a dimension of Jesus' teaching which she'd never understood before, it wasn't taught in any of the churches, she wanted to call this discovery moral science, because it had to do with the consciousness of good. Something that she recognized, even the most depraved sinner has at least some ability to weigh things and to make a distinction between good and evil. And that's exactly what spiritual sense is. It's that element of our awareness of good, our awareness of that which is godlike, and our ability to make the distinction between that and the rest that we can get rid of. And that's what is needed in this whole process of identification of individuals, where we want to get rid of the physical picture, but we also want to get rid of the association of the individual with the past, with historical policies, with attitudes and so forth. Things that I'm thinking of the present political situation, in which we're constantly kind of reminded what he said this, and all those kinds of things which get in the way of us being able to appreciate their real divine identity. And that's what's essential. It's our ability to be able to not only identify that set of godlike characteristics, but recognize they're beautiful. They're wonderful. And our ability to do that, of course, is enabling us to love. It's getting to the point where we're able to love our so-called enemy. Okay. Now, you're driving very responsibly down I-89, and suddenly some cowboy zips past you, and then as soon as he gets past you, he swerves in front of you, slams on the brakes. I don't know about you, but my tendency is to, stupid idiot. Now, the question comes, do we forgive the stupid idiot? Okay, you've laughed, that's good. Because we should laugh at that idea. The stupid idiot needs to be absent from our thinking. And sometimes it takes a while to remove that identification. But that's the goal. So that we're not dealing with stupid idiots. And we're not. And this is digging deeper. Mary Baker talks about Christ Jesus as plunging beneath the material surface to find the spiritual cause. And that's what we're engaged in. And that's essential. That's an essential part of forgiving and then reaching that final goal of loving. And I think later we're going to see that in turn has a goal of healing. No hands at this point, so we're all together. That's great. Forgiveness during the second half of the 20th century was something very difficult to express towards one country. And just to remind you, I know many of you are familiar with that as history or maybe have been through it, and that is the last 50 years of the 20th century. This is a very, very gross picture, but basically represents an improvement in the recognition of human rights. It wasn't a smooth upward curve, lots of ups and downs, but there was the breakup of the English Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, countries gaining independence, greater recognition for the rights of man. The rights of man is the Human Rights Declaration, a part of the United Nations, and every country in the world, at least verbally or writtenly, associating themselves with it. This is the case throughout the world, again at a very general level, except for one country, South Africa. 1948, a government came into power which felt that it was best, this is a country 80% black, more than 80%, less than 20% white, but it was best to have a separation, black and white, black and African colors and all the rest, separated from the white. And that's called apartheid in Afrikaans, and the policy, reprehensible as it was, since it was only the whites that could vote, that had any rights whatsoever in the country, was opposed by other parts of the world. And it seemed as though the more opposition to that from the outside, the stronger the apartheid government dug its heels. Reaction on the part of the Africans, black Africans, and response on the part of the government of massacres. Massacre after massacre. And it wasn't that the African National Congress that represented the bulk of the black population didn't try to sabotage it, but they were so totally outgunned that the result was horrendous. And it seemed as though the country was continually going further in the direction of supporting that policy. The idea that there was any other possible consequence to the continuation of this policy, other than the bloodiest revolution that the world had ever seen, didn't exist. Everyone agreed it was inevitable. And I had experience, this was the beginning of the 80s. There were a number of black Africans, South Africans, all of whom had spent time in South African jails, who were in the Pittsburgh area. The leader, Dennis Brutus, recognized that there was a need, of course there was going to be the revolution, but there would be a need for, after the revolution, having some kind of structure, constitution of some kind in hand that would be available for a beginning of the definition of the equal distribution of rights and so forth. And I just had the wonderful experience of being invited to work with these individuals. I had, of course, taught constitutional law, I'd been active in civil rights, but I think, frankly, that God was leading me in that direction. And the work we did together it was extraordinary. What I found among these individuals was a mentality for which forgiveness was natural, which was epitomized actually by some of the activists that were still living in South Africa. One of the prime activists was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who received the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize. And in his acceptance speech, he said, "A life without forgiveness isn't a life worth living." And who is in many ways epitomized of this recognition of the importance of forgiveness. And it was within the complete mentality of these individuals I was working with. Dennis and I became friends. I explained to him some of the insights I'd gained in that preceding experience with the city council in Pittsburgh. And he was very open to that. And he gathered the rest of the individuals that we were working with. We spent evenings talking about this true nature, the spiritual forgiveness as opposed to just human forgiveness. And as we were working, it became clear that there was going to be a need, again after the revolution, for there to be some kind of bringing together of the disparate parts of the cultures, a kind of mending of the social tears and the social fabric. And we proposed something which had been tried out in a couple of countries. We tweaked a number of the characteristics of it. It was a court in which individuals would be able to ask for forgiveness under certain conditions. And as we were working on this second document, what for me was the greatest miracle of the 20th century took place. There was a new president of South Africa. Botha, the preceding president, who was horrible, was replaced by someone who was supposed to be even worse, F.W. de Klerk. And he was expected to go even further right in the extremist activities of the government. But one of his first acts was one of forgiveness. He pardoned Nelson Mandela, that individual which had been 27 years in South African prisons, most of them in solitary confinement. Forgiving, pardoning Mandela began a kind of snowball of forgiveness. The ANC forgave aspects of the policies of the apartheid government. The apartheid government continued to forgive and in many cases released prisoners. That was in 1990, February 11th of 1990. 4 years later, there were elections, probably the most democratic elections in the whole history of the continent of Africa. And Mandela was elected president, as you know. And that's not the end of the story. Because one of the early decisions on the part of the Mandela government was to take our idea of reconciliation, creating a court structure within which, if an individual is a court with judges and so forth, but if an individual for any act preceding 1990 illegal, and there were tens of thousands, but an individual who had committed one of these crimes and they were getting ready to prosecute him, but if they explained completely what they had done and asked forgiveness in the judgment of the judges were sincere in the face and the presence of their victims, of the families of the victims, they could be granted forgiveness, amnesty. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established. Tutu was the head of the institution. And I don't know, you may have seen PBS has some absolutely heartrending films of some of the cases, because they are heartrending, and the ones that are really sincere, and where there's a kind of opening up and an explanation that doesn't satisfy justice in a formal sense, but it brings a resolution that thousands of people, tens of thousands of South Africans found. And in fact, it was so successful in those years, 95 and 96, that it's been imitated now 17 times. Well, actually, I discovered yesterday, Thursday, that probably more. The 70 different countries have used it for the same purpose. Countries like Chile and Rwanda, Morocco, where there's been horrible repression, the need to mend the social fabric. But also in Canada, vis-a-vis the Eskimos and the Indians. And as I learned a couple of days ago, Maine apparently had a kind of truth and reconciliation process, again with regard to the Indians in that state. Well, the breakthrough that Mary Baker Eddy made, I want to just say a few words about that because it's something which was the turning point in her life. And I've just made a couple of references to it up to this point. This was this life, this 19th century life beginning in 1821, ending in 1910, right in the middle point. The first half had been full of sickness and medical problems. But at that middle point, there was a breakthrough that Mary Baker Eddy experienced. She had, up to that point, relied, first of all, on prayer. She grew up in a very religious family and through prayer had recognized that God could heal. And she was helped, at least temporarily, but never on a permanent basis. She tried all the medical systems. And again, felt occasional relief, but never on a permanent basis. And then there came this experience that she had, an accident which her physician indicated was going to be fatal. She probably had several days to live. And again, she turned to the Bible. And this time was able to identify what Jesus was teaching to his students as something that could be understood and could be used very simply and concretely as a basis for healing. And she doesn't spell out in very explicit form, but there's clearly several things that she identifies later that were key to her healing. One of them is what I've already described as this use of spiritual sense. And I want to read a kind of mini description of, this is from Science and Health, the Key to the Scriptures. This is the book that she really paid a lot of attention to, or the other books that she wrote, but this one is one that she recognized was literally a key to the Scriptures, and one that she came back to make easy to understand, easy to apply to, because she wanted it to be a kind of textbook for healing, something that people would refer back to and use as a constant guide, both for understanding the real message of the Bible and for using the ideas that Jesus was teaching. So here's this just two-sentence description of her understanding of how Jesus healed. She said, Jesus beheld in science, that's from a purely spiritual perspective, so he was using the spiritual sense. Jesus beheld in science the perfect man who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. And then she gives the key. She says, in this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness. And this correct view of man healed the sick. He saw, obviously not the physical in any way, he saw with his spiritual sense God, the likeness of God, recognizing that each of us is the image and likeness of God. And it was that which was at least a part of the insight that she received. The other element that was absolutely crucial in this is something that I've been talking about from the very beginning, that is the nature of forgiveness as the basis of love, as the basis of healing. So that it's and it coincides with that idea of using spiritual sense to identify accurately an individual, perhaps oneself, or a patient or an individual who's asking for healing, as was so often the case in Jesus' experience, sometimes not even asking. But that ability to identify the divine and see its beauty, and of course then to love it, and to recognize that that's the only response we could possibly have to something that's so wonderful and so beautiful as the real identity of ourselves or our creation. And that's loving ourselves, our spiritual identity. And it's loving others as he commands us to do. Love thy neighbor as thou love thyself. Well, this breakthrough was something that it's kind of interesting because interesting to me because I think in thinking of what happened when she made this breakthrough and she was healed. It took place 3 days after she was brought into this apartment, not expected to survive. And without going into the details of what immediately followed, her immediate response was something that, as I think back and just imagine my own experience had I undergone a healing of that nature, I think it would be, wow, this is wonderful. I'm free, and I want to, be able to enjoy and express and exercise that freedom. Her response was that, frankly, of a scientist. What's going on here? How did this happen? How can I understand what is taking place here? And she immediately turned to the Bible to understand what was going on. And it was just as though she was anxious to understand there's something to be comprehended, not just on an intellectual basis, though that's a part of it, but to understand the spiritual dimensions of this. And she knew that if she were able to master that understanding, that she would be able to heal. And she had that expectation. She started exploring deeply the Bible, but at the same time, putting into practice those ideas that she discovered. And she found, yes, there is something here that I can use as a basis for healing. And within that first year, she healed cases of cancer, tuberculosis, physical deformity. She later was asked to give lectures as she felt that she was beginning to get a grasp on how this dimension of Jesus' teaching was the basis of healing. She went to Newport, Rhode Island, where she gave a lecture, and as a result of that lecture, there was a healing. And the community was so excited about that healing that took place that the medical faculty and some of the town fathers, especially the religious people, were so upset she was to give 2 lectures. He went around and took down all of the posters for her second lecture and prevented her from giving that second lecture. But this is something which had obviously stirred that community. And as she went forward, that scientific understanding that she kind of intuitively, I think, she was a natural scientist. Just before this healing experience that she had, looked at from a scientific standpoint, she analyzed the placebo effect. In fact, she discovered it. She described it. She communicated with the medical faculty who kind of poo-pooed the idea. And she was the discoverer of this phenomenon in human experience. It was only almost a generation later that finally, yes, it does exist. And there is such a thing as a placebo effect. Now, I give that just because this was her mental approach. And it carried over into not only the need to understand how to heal herself, but of course the final test would be, could she teach this way of healing to someone else in such a way that they, in turn, could become a healer. And just as with Jesus, his students were not the intellectual cream of the crop that Judea in his day, they were simple fishermen. So in Mary Baker Eddy's experience, her first student was a simple shoe factory employee in Lynn, Massachusetts. But she found she was able, this was an individual who had the same kind of respect and appreciation of Mary Baker Eddy as Jesus' students had of Jesus. And he was able to understand and to, in fact, heal. And now she had that confirmation. This is something scientifically provable, understandable, and something which could be called a science. And so she began, and there was an increasing demand actually for healing. She began teaching teachers. And the movement expanded such that after 20 years she was sending out teachers to various cities of the world, especially the city of New York. In fact, there were quite a few teachers in New York City. And what should happen after a couple of years? Conflict. There was one of those teachers, these are all her students, but one of those teachers felt that, yes, Mary Baker Eddy was the leader, but she was the sub-leader in this area around New York City. That was her area, and she could dominate it completely. And she did, in a not very sympathetic or democratic way. And there was reaction. What I'd like to do is to read a part of a letter, because of course Mary Baker Eddy became aware of this, and recognized that it needed to be dealt with, and that forgiveness was crucial in resolving this problem. And the letter indicates, this is a letter to Laura Lathrop, one of the other teachers. It indicates both the mental attitudes that are crucial in the whole process of forgiveness, but also the recognition that it's crucial to have behavior flowing naturally from this correction of the mental approach. She says, these are just a few sentences from the letter. You have entered the straight and narrow path that leads to bliss, eternal, ever-unfolding love. Oh, press on, darling. Never look back. Love all, underline. Overcome evil with good. Bless them that do not feel like blessing you. Oh, love everyone, and especially love your enemy, if you have one under. Later she goes on, do good to them that know not how to do themselves good. Help them to know. And still later she says, go to Mrs. Stetson. That's the charismatic troublemaker. Go to Mrs. Stetson, put your arms around her neck. Tell her how you feel. Oh, love one another, even as Jesus the Christ hath loved you. And then she ends the letter with, I thank my Father for your new birth. Well, for Laura Lathrop, that was a new birth. She apparently accepted, in fact, the next letter indicated her gratitude for essentially setting her back on the right track. And it was the solution. It wasn't the solution to the problem of Augustus Stetson, that was to come later. But it was such a beautiful expression of naturalness of forgiveness. And its accompaniment by the human manifestations of forgiveness that are a natural consequence when we change our thinking. I want to fast forward now 100 years. That was 1890, so we'll enter 1990. Into a family, the mother, Susan, has been married for 20 years. Her children, she has 4 children, were brought up as Christian scientists. She's the person who discovered Christian Science in her younger years. And she's found that it's wonderfully helpful. She's resolved physical, financial problems through prayer, the kind of prayer I talked about. And one day she learns that her husband has been unfaithful. Not just at the moment, he's been unfaithful for the whole marriage. And this is a shock to Susan. She has a heart attack. Part of her side is paralyzed. Her left arm is paralyzed as well. And as a Christian Scientist who has experienced healing, she knows, she feels what she can do. She calls a practitioner. Now, in Christian Science, there isn't any clergy, but there is this office of practitioner, which is a activity of someone who wants to, on a full-time basis, make themselves available through prayer to help anyone, non-Christian Scientist or Christian Scientist, through prayer. But again, prayer of the nature that I've described, the spiritual understanding of God's laws. Well, she explains to the practitioner the situation, and the practitioner responds with, well, my dear, of course you must begin by first forgiving your husband and his mistress. What? Who's the victim here? Was Susan's response. This was just going too far. And she knew that she had had healings, really striking healings in the past, so that she felt she could take on her own case, and she thanked the practitioner, but was going to work on her own. And she did. She began with some of the same ideas that I described, accurately identifying her spiritual nature, her godlike being, and seeing it as clearly as she could. During that same time, the mistress was making things a little difficult, sent the love letters back actually to Susan that she received over those 20 years, and started calling her eldest child, harassing in different ways. Susan was almost tempted to call the police, but guys, no, I know I can handle this, and through prayer. Days went into weeks, weeks into months, and there wasn't any healing. In fact, the paralysis started creeping up into her shoulder, her cheek. Her arm at that point had, through lack of use, lost half its dimension. And she wrestled with this idea that, well, should I forgive my husband? And always that thought, no, this is something that's unforgivable. This betrayal, it's just something I can't accept. And then there was a time that came when she was working with, as she understood the laws of God's government, as laws, as universal laws applicable to everyone. And she saw that if she were to understand them as a universal law, in which everyone was identified as subject to that law, and this law was a law of spiritual government, of spiritual development, such that those governed by the laws, these divine laws, are spiritual, pure, perfect, and they need to be recognized as such. She saw that she had to accept that, of course, this applied to her husband. Otherwise, it wouldn't be universal. Of course, it applied to his mistress. And this is just a natural consequence of that sense of law. It's universal, and it governs everyone. And it wasn't that there was a sudden healing, but there was progress just in her ability to see her husband in this different light, and gradually come to the point of not just human forgiveness, but spiritual forgiveness, as I've described it, where she was beginning to be able to see the beauty of his godlike nature, not accepting in any way as though it could be justified, his behavior. That was a totally different realm. But with her spiritual sense, she was able to sense his real identity. And the healing took place. The regaining completely of the use of her arm, and today she's quite an athlete. In fact, she became a Christian Science practitioner. Not too long after that, she and her husband came to an amicable divorce. I've been describing essentially forgiveness. I think I've been describing, first of all, the importance of focusing on our thought. The fact that that's our responsibility. And that it's crucial. From that flows everything. And I've tried to show that forgiveness is something that is a natural consequence, if we use this approach of spiritual forgiveness, of being able accurately to identify our nature and the nature of all those within our thinking. I really appreciate to the point, and this of course is the next step where we're able to love. In fact, forgiveness is an essential ingredient in learning to love. And finally, that whole process of learning to love God, learning to love God expressed as our own identity, and as the identity of everyone else, leads to healing. Now, I want to close. There's going to be an opportunity for question and answers, but I think some of you may have some other obligations this lovely Saturday afternoon. But I want to close with a challenge. And I do this because I want to encourage you to not just take these ideas as, well, that's a nice explanation of some interesting phenomenon, and then move on. I really would like you to take, if you felt that there's anything that's useful or helpful in your own thinking, to test it, put it into practice, use it. Thus this challenge. Today we live in a world which, using the term hatred, is politically incorrect. So choose the individual in your thought whom you love the least. Now you have chuckled and I think not just because of the wording of it, but also because you recognize, wonderful and perfect as we all are, we all have those individuals in our thinking. We live in a world in which the distinction between the good guys and the bad guys is very important. We've grown up with that as a part of our thinking, and we all have it, so no one is exempt here. No one has arrived at that point where there isn't someone who you love a little least and less than others. And of course, the challenge is to take this individual and use what I've been describing as spiritual forgiveness as a means of arriving at that point where you can love completely. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. So, if there are any questions, I'd love to respond. It's all crystal clear, I guess. Any challenge? Well, let me just say one last thing, and that was something that I covered very briefly during our time together. But I want to caution you, because if you take my challenge seriously, and I hope you will, because I think that's the way to make progress, really engaging with these ideas. And the temptation is going to come, as I mentioned earlier, to find in that individual or that group or even that nation something good. Because that you're going to sense that's leading me to feeling not so bad about how terrible they are. And that's not helpful. Now, the reason that this is crucial is because you want to stay within the context of an understanding of God's government, of divine government, not of man's government. And in this regard, it's helpful to see, I think, that the sense of human justice is something which comes secondarily. It's not unimportant. In fact, it's crucially important. But we have developed institutions. They're imperfect, but they're institutions which measure out justice and determine punishment or resolution from guilt in one way or another. And those institutions, they're wonderful. We need to appreciate them. We need to develop them more fully so they are actually able to exercise their function in our society better. But that's a different world. And what I'm asking you to work in is what Jesus called the kingdom of God. Now, it's important to recognize that these other institutions exist because as we mentally arrive at the point where we can forgive, we're not saying they shouldn't be punished if they've done something horrible, and it's the judgment, accurate judgment of the society is that there should be a punishment. That's right. And I think where we are in our form of human development, that should exist, needs to exist. But that's, again, a different world. Leave that, and the way in which you can protect yourself from entering into it mentally is by recognizing that we're not acknowledging the good that the individual may have done human. And, you know, Hitler, he loved his dog. Stalin appreciated the ballet. I mean, we can go on. This is something counterproductive because it leads us in our thinking back into the nature of the problem. What I'm encouraging you to do is, with your thought, lift it to the point where you're able to sense spiritually the divine, the godlike nature of yourself, of course, but of these individuals whom you're learning to love more fully. And as you do that, I think you'll find yourself growing. If you would like, and I would encourage you, if you feel that you've really made some progress in this regard, email me, John M. Tyler. You will usually get Google that. I say this because I've had a lot of making collection, and it's wonderful. You know, the kind of freedom that comes, because this is a burden that we all have. And some of, you know, when I was hating, I felt it was a good burden, I wanted it, and that was a horrible idea, counterproductive. But we can free ourselves and learn in the process to love. Yes?
I want to ask about forgiveness for myself, personal sense to an individual. I can achieve that, but how do you handle the view of other people, you know, groups of other people that haven't forgiven this individual, and you see it all around.
Yes.
This hatred or this despising of this person. How do you correct that view?
You don't. Those that sufficient unto the evil, unto the day is the evil thereof. I think we don't. We allow other people have their problems, and they're going to have to work them out. This is working out one's own salvation. We need to. We can help humanly. I mean, there's all kinds of things, and to some degree, that's what meetings like this are. You know, we're helping, I think, along those lines. But don't feel yourself burdened or responsible for their progress. I mean, your love is going to lead you into ways in which you can help them. And second, recognizing that that's the case. And in doing so, of course, it's crucial to see, just the way I stated, love is leading. Love is doing the action. So it's not your responsibility, you're not, you know, carrying any burden whatsoever. You're going to be led to do that. But then you leave it completely in divine love's hands. And with the recognition, love is governed. It's going to guide in its own way. Good question. I'm sorry. Yes, no, please.
I have a question. Can you pray and ask God to help you in this process?
Of course. Yes. Can we pray? That's what largely prayer is. Yes, and the recognition of that's crucial. It's not, and you may have had the impression that, I'm saying you should do this and it's all your responsibility. No, the whole sense of as we enter into what Jesus called God's kingdom, we're entering into a realm, mentally, in which that action of the Christ is God made manifest in our human experience. And that's taking place. So it's leading us, and of course we're turning to God in order to acknowledge that the government of God is here for ourselves and for others as we see them. Does that make sense? Great. Thanks again. Thank you very much.
Good night.